Hello and welcome to FlippedHarber for Algebra 2. This video is going to be over section 2.8, solving absolute value equations and inequalities. Our objectives for the lesson include solving compound inequalities and being able to write and solve absolute value equations and inequalities. Our topics will include absolute value equations and absolute value inequalities, compound inequalities, and disjunctions and conjunctions. First of all, compound inequalities are two inequalities that are separated by the words and or. When we see the word or between two inequalities, it creates what we refer to as a disjunction. That is, each inequality creates its own separate region on the number line. If we use the word and in between two inequalities, it creates a conjunction, where the two inequalities create one region on the number line. To solve a compound inequality and to graph it, we just need to treat each inequality separately and solve accordingly. So with my inequality on the left, I just need to divide by the 6 and I get y is less than -4. To solve the inequality on the right, I subtract over the 5 and I get y is greater than or equal to -2. So you can see that y is less than 4 creates a region starting at -4 and pointing to the left. Y is greater than or equal to -2 creates a region that starts at -2 and points to the right. So it's a disjunction because the two regions do not overlap in any way, shape, or form. The solution set is all the points that satisfy either situation. So we use a fancy symbol which just means that we use the union of the two. It's just a fancy word for or. Let's try a conjunction this time. An inequality, two inequalities, separated by the word and. We're still going to solve them separately. In the first one, we'll multiply by the 2 to get c is greater than or equal to -4. In the second inequality, we subtract over the 1 and divide by 2 and get c is less than 0. So the two inequalities work together to create a region in between the two numbers. C is greater than -4, so that means that it's to the right of -4, and it's less than 0. So we're limited to the numbers that are to the right of -4 and to the left of 0. So that's only the region in between. Alright, let's try another one. Is this going to be a conjunction or a disjunction? Well, the tip-off is the word or. Solving them separately, we get x is less than 3 or x is greater than or equal to 5. This would be a disjunction. Now, you're probably all familiar what an absolute value function is, or what an absolute value is. The absolute value of a real number is equal to its distance from 0 on the number line. Basically, absolute values remove negatives. They don't change the sign, they just remove negatives. So the absolute value of 5 is 5. The absolute value of -5 is also 5. We can have equations with absolute values. We can have inequalities with absolute values. We'll talk about how to solve these. Solving an absolute value equation requires us to remove the absolute value from the variable and write two separate equations that have the word or in between. So the absolute value of x equal to a has to be rewritten as x equals -a or x equals a. Make sure you're writing that word or. It's very, very important. Let's solve this absolute value equation. The first thing we do is write it as two separate equations with the word or. -3 plus k equals 10 or -3 plus k equals -10. Solve each separately. You get k equals 13 or k equals -7. Make sure you write that word or. Let's take a little different equation and solve it. Whenever you've got a number outside that absolute value, whether that number is subtracting, as it is here, or if it's multiplying or dividing, you always need to get rid of anything outside the absolute value before we split the equation. So I need to add that 6 over before I split the equation. Now that it's an absolute value on the left side all alone, now I can split it. So I get x over 4 equals 4, or x over 4 equals negative 4. Solve the two equations separately. I get x equals 16, or x equals negative 16. Solving an absolute value inequality requires us to know and understand that these inequalities will create conjunctions or disjunctions. Whenever the absolute value is less than a, it creates a conjunction. Whenever the absolute value is greater than a, it creates a disjunction. And then we just solve the two inequalities separately. Let's solve this absolute value inequality. The first thing we need to decide, is this going to be a conjunction or is it going to be a disjunction? Well, this one is going to be a disjunction because the absolute value is greater than 10. Now notice, and this is very important, that when you change it from a 10 to a negative 10, we flip the sign. Whenever you change the sign on the number, you flip the inequality. Solve the two separately, but similarly, we first subtract 2 from both sides. Then we divide by negative 4 on both sides. Now again, when we divide by a negative, we flip the sign. So both inequalities were flipped. So q is less than negative 2, or q is greater than 3. Graphing, we put a closed circle at negative 2 and shade to the left. We put a closed circle at 3 and shade to the right. Let's solve this absolute value inequality. Is it going to be a conjunction or a disjunction? Again, because the absolute value is greater than 7, it's a disjunction. Now the one that becomes negative 7, we flip the inequality. Subtract 1 over in both inequalities. Divide by negative 2 in both inequalities, and we get x is less than negative 3, or x is greater than 4. Graphing, we use open circles at negative 3 and negative 4, negative 3 and positive 4, and we shade out. What about this inequality? Well, first thing we got to do is get rid of that 12. Always get rid of anything outside the absolute value before you split the inequality or the equation. So now is this one going to be a conjunction or a disjunction? Because it's less than or equal to 21, it's a conjunction. 7x is less than or equal to 21, and 7x has to be greater than or equal to negative 21. Again, we flip the inequality on the number that changes signs. Dividing by 7 in both cases, x has to be less than 3 and x has to be greater than or equal to negative 3. So we put a closed circle at negative 3 and 3, and we shade in between because it's a conjunction. Alright, that's it. It's time to get started on the homework. I'll see you in class, and I'll see you online.